a call out, a shout out to the Under One Roof website, which went online with a range of stakeholders about 2 years ago. And it's an absolutely excellent, more detailed, but nonetheless easily accessible version of what we're going to be talking about today. It covers a whole range of buildings, from tenements to modern flats to what I believe in Glasgow they call cottage tenements, right down to normal house types in a sort of easy drop down menu way. It's very, very good. So without further ado, a stitch in time. What do I mean? When I was growing up, my grandmother had an old house in Kirstorfen. Even after my grandfather had gone, she knew when she was going to be getting the roads cleared. She knew when she was going to get the roofer work done. She knew when the windows would require painting. And she always used to say to me that if a house had a hat and a raincoat, it would be fine. And I eventually became an architect and got involved in this and bought my own house. I realised just how correct she was. 90% of work to an existing building is about timeliness, maintenance, and good traditional care. Now that may seem obvious to a lot of us, but you know, we're in an age now where a lot of people have plastic gutters, plastic windows, modern cement tiles, not the same maintenance, and that can catch a lot of people out. So what I would say, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted tonight, is that anybody with a traditional roof, and I even include a traditional clay tile in this, really has to have a slater out at least once a year, just going over the roof. It's not expensive. I'm about £300 a year. You need to get your roans and your downpipes running clear. And some of you in South Ayrshire will use the word roan to mean downpipes as well as gutters, so I apologise. You need to watch for dampness. And in a traditional building, you'd need to deal with it immediately. You can't afford to let things fester, unfortunately. And that's easy to say. I wouldn't like to be trying to repair a slated roof on a day like the weather's been today in most of Ayrshire. And of course, some poor devil, and it's a thankless task, has to be out repainting the woodwork every 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 if you've a modern porous paint. And if you've got masonry paint in your building like my house has, you're about every 5 or 6 years. So I say that just keep on top of that is the starting point. But let's get stuck into a quick overview of some more technical stuff. And I'm deliberately starting with masonry work and stonework in particular, for no reason other than when we ran the Kilmarnock and the Irvine schemes, that's where we got a lot of queries from householders. In the last sort of 30 years, stonework seems to have become a dark art. I mean, the last Ayrshire firm, traditional firm that did masonry non-stop was probably Reeves of Cawtron, who went down, I think, when I was a student, so the early 90s. And there's not as many stonemasons out there. So what do we have to watch for on that? And what I'm about to run through, I'll cover traditional stonework, traditional solid wall brickwork. I'll touch on mortars. I'll probably not say too much about render, maybe just in the passing. But the key thing is this rather bad sketch I've done. A modern house with a cavity wall relies on the cavity to keep out water. You're creating a waterproof mac over the whole thing, a proper mac. But in a traditional solid wall building, you're not. You're trying to create a Gore-Tex jacket, something that breathes. The masonry is meant to absorb water. It uses a very soft, breathable mortar, as we'll see in a minute, and that allows the water to dry back out the wall very, very quickly. It also means any moisture within the building that permeates the walls from, you know, cooking and baths and all the rest of it can escape through the solid walls. And the reason we render buildings in Scotland isn't just because our stone isn't as good as some other parts of the UK, but also, believe it or not, the open texture of a traditional render, line render, helps that moisture escape your building. So the reason I flag this up is that a lot of the time people have problems when they try to treat the stone as if it's waterproof. If they put clear impermeable coatings on it, they put really solid masonry paint on it, and that traps water within the core. And we'll have a look at in a minute at some pictures of what happens. And I think it might be familiar to a few of you, just from experience. So we need to let the walls breathe. We need to avoid any coating, clear or otherwise, which traps dampness, and care is required, because some people claim that they're their coatings are breathable, but are they breathable enough? And you know, my house used to be finished in gloss paint on the stonework, so you can imagine how impermeable that was. Again, the roans and the downpipes are important. We need to keep water from getting in at the head of the wall, but also let's not forget the base of it. There's not really such a thing as rising damp in Scotland in the same extent as limestone areas in England. But you know, water can splash up 6 or 8 inches from pavements and patios. It can bridge damp-proof courses. So we need to have permeable coatings at the base of the walls. And what we're going to be looking at are some examples of general erosion, some poor quality stonework and original details, 1 or 2 shots, but not many, inappropriate techniques. And then I'm actually going to talk you through why some of the modern chemicals aren't a good idea, and we'll maybe touch on mortars. Now, this, I'll tell you right now, this is my own office before we moved into it. And as you can see, now hopefully you can see my mouse moving about there. Duncan, is the mouse visible?
Yes, that mouse is visible, yes.
Yeah, perfect. So you can see this is made out of what those of us from Ayrshire will call Ballochmyle sandstone, and those from further afield insist on calling Mauchline stone. There's actually 3 Ballochmyle quarries. All the stones are slightly different, but they suffer the same problem, and that's if it gets damp, the stone erodes back quite quickly. And you can see here that just outside, funnily enough, the window next to me now, we've got this area of quite serious looking erosion. But you can also see that that's purely caused by water coming through this open joint here in the cornice and that open joint there. Now these have been fixed now, but if that had maybe been fixed 10 or 15 years before the building had been reached this stage, it would literally have saved the owner thousands of pounds. A stone about that size, without the bit next to the window, to replace in natural stones, about £350 a pop before you have your scaffold and stuff. So that's what I'm saying. We need to keep a waterproof hat on the building. We need to deal with these minor things to keep water away from the fabric. You can see yourself that someone's done a previous repair here to the lintel, and they've got the weight wrong and they've actually split the mullion, but that's quite rare. Now, one of the problems, the reason I'm saying we shouldn't use cement is that cement traps water within the wall. Cement's not breathable. You might as well cover your building in cling film if you're going to put a lot of cement on it. And that means that the water escapes through the joints in the stone. This is a rubble wall in Callander, if I remember correctly, and you can see it's been quite a nice blonde sandstone. But you know, the cement's trapped the water, and as a result, that stone's eroded back the better part of 1/4 of an inch. I can use new money if people prefer, but it's not even pointed well. The pointing's only about ½ an inch deep, and you can see there's old lime behind it. And pointing needs to be at least 1.5 inches deep, you know, at least about 40 millimeters, if it's to have any chance of surviving more than sort of 10 years. So I'd be quite cautious about this. Also, we've got this yellow staining, and you'll see more of that in a minute, and that's irons within the blonde sandstone being brought to the surface by the amount of water going through it, and when that starts, it's not very good. Very important to avoid that. Now, this is an example of someone trying to repoint their wall, and they've made 2 mistakes here. So the top half is original, and it's quite nicely pointed, tight joints, nice Ballochmyle sandstone. On the bottom half, they've used white cement, but moreover, to rake out the joints to prepare it for pointing, they've used an angle grinder. And if any of you have used an angle grinder, you'll know the minimum cut's about 1/4 of an inch. And what they've done is they've opened up every joint to get the mortar in, and it's completely changed the appearance of the wall. It's not a thing of beauty, unfortunately. There was no need to do that. If the lime will come out with a hacksaw blade quite quickly. I've done it myself. So we've got to watch for contractors that might try and take you down that road, and there's no need. Now here's an example of a coating that's going on a wall. This is a 1980s material called Lunarstone, sometimes in the west of Scotland called Lunarstone, and essentially it's a smooth cement render. And when it's wet, you throw sand on it to look like sandstone. Any of you that have spent time in the West End or the South Side in Glasgow will have seen acres of this stuff, perhaps without realising it. And the trouble is, because it's cement based and it's resin based, it traps the water. And what happens is that the stone behind it eventually powders away and the stuff clours off the wall in big chunks. Very often if you hear in Glasgow about stone falling off a building, it's not stone, it's some of this inch thick linatol or Lunarstone that they've put on it. And they've probably taken stone that was a little bit tired looking, and unfortunately in this particular case they've killed it stone dead by trapping water in it. And the big giveaway for me are these weathering details here where the water sits. You can see they've gone at a faster rate in those. So we need to be very careful when we're looking at repairs to stone buildings about these supposedly high-tech modern buildings. There are breathable versions available, which we use. We're talking about using some in the town hall, but there's a need for specialist advice on how we use them. Also, I mentioned earlier chemical damage. This is also Hillhead. I'm really hoping it's not going to turn out to be Duncan's house or anything like that. And this is a building that was cleaned probably in the early noughties without consent, which is why it's flagged up on my radar, using a very aggressive chemical cleaner. And you'll remember I mentioned earlier the iron and the damp stone. Well, look how much worse it is on this one. And what most of these chemical cleaners have very strong acids, very often hydrofluoric acid in it. And unless you're an industrial chemist, you'll have never seen hydrofluoric acid. It's double fume cabinet stuff, not even for SYS chemistry. And that actually dissolves the clays and the iron and the stone and brings them to the surface. And what you end up is a kind of stripy effect building, but that weakens the stone. And as we walk around the corner, and this is the same building, I never established why they hadn't painted the windows the same colour. You can see that where the damp is, it's starting to weather very fast. So again, you don't really need to do this. If you're going to clean a building, a very light wash at hose pressure will do it. Take off the worst of it. Avoid abrasive materials. Avoid difficult chemicals unless you've got advice from an architect or a surveyor, building surveyor. You know, and the people that wrought this damage to that house, they'll not own it anymore. They'll be gone. They may unfortunately no longer even be with us. So it's the next generation that often pick up the problems. So as I say, don't clean stone without specialist advice. In any event, stone cleaning in a listed building or in a conservation area always requires permission. Don't use cement mortars. Use lime mortars. They're readily available. You can get them from Juicens, although in reality, you know, there's specialist suppliers that'll do it a wee bit cheaper. They're easy to work with. We're hoping to train people in the Maybole Regeneration Scheme and how to use them. Always replace stone with real stone. Don't use these plastic coatings. It's not cheap, which is why the maintenance is so expensive. And workmanship's critical. You want to try and find experienced stonemasons for really complex work. Now, that said, two of the best pointers I've ever met were actually brickies, both from Cumnock direct. Well, one might have been Mochland, but certainly in that neck of the woods. So I don't want to be sniffy about just stonemasons. But stonemasons have got, you know, a bit more experience in that. But these firms do exist locally. Yeah, there's you know, more than a handful now. I remember when there were only two in Ayrshire. We must be somewhere between 5 and 10 now that regularly work across all of the county and quite often in Glasgow. Now let's jump on to roofer work. Now, slate. You've all seen slate. Maybole's full of it. Kilmarnock's full of it. The most common material from the 17th century onwards. The reason mid-17th century is that we suffered a series of large town fires, including Kilmarnock. Not a bad thing, you may say, but also Ayr and other towns. And thatch was effectively outlawed in the boroughs progressively through the 17th, 18th and into the 19th centuries. But those were the times that the Scottish slate quarries at Ballachulish and places like that were opening up. We've got, I've lumped Ballachulish in as West Highland, but there's about 6 different flavours. We've got the Trossach slate, which is very uncommon here, so it's a green slate, and so on. There's some slightly iffy stuff from the East Coast. And then with the arrival of the railways, we get a lot of Welsh slate. Welsh slate tends to be very good quality, very thin, very uniform appearance, but very good. We've got Northumbrian, and you may be thinking, where would we have Northumbrian slate? But I'll tell you right now, there's a building with a turret. I'll let you find it yourself. In Maybole High Street, that's got a very nice English slate on it. It's a kind of greeny blue colour. And then we've also, more recently, in the last 20 years, we've had modern imports, mainly from Spain, a smaller number from China, and sometimes a lovely green slate from Vermont. Now, Spain actually produces very good slates. The trouble is that most of those slates are actually in France and Germany. It's a bit more variable what we get in the UK, as I'll show you in a minute, as I explain the advantages of the UK slates if you're repairing your house. Now, a properly built and laid Scottish slate roof, in fact, a Welsh one as well, will last 70 to 100 years with regular maintenance. My own roof is about 130 years old, and it's probably got about another 10 years left in it if I keep maintaining it properly. It looks good, it's traditional, it's easy to repair. Concrete tiles, in my last house had concrete tiles. Believe it or not, concrete tiles are generally only guaranteed for 15 to 20 years and have a design lifespan of 40 years. So if you replace a roof with a modern one, there's a whole host of issues, not just appearance, but you're also introducing something that perhaps your family, perhaps the next generation will have to redo sooner than might have been the case. So a shout out to traditional ones. Now, these two roofs are both in calendar, just in case anyone's getting worried. The kind of hill at the back's a bit of a giveaway. It's not Maybole or indeed Ayrshire. But this is what we see all the time. The slate on the left, my left, is a Trosses slate, and the slate on the right is a Ballachulish slate. And you could all point to examples of this around about our areas. Hopefully your buildings aren't in this kind of condition. This is just age. The Trosses slate here is very soft, so it's got nail sickness, as it's called. It'll do as a term, and it's clouring off the roof. But you see, it's a lot of small slates, and they're quite they tend to detach in strong winds. The Scottish roof is better, but again, look at these big voids. The slates are lifting, they're going up, they're going down. The wind gets under them, it drives rain in. We've got one slate here that someone's put in upside down with a nice nail hole in it. This roof, believe it or not, is still savable. You probably about the same cost reslating it, but you could overhaul that one. Whereas this one here, unfortunately, is past the point of return. The one behind, which is Welsh, it is marginally better except the top, and that's eminently savable. So don't panic if your roof's bad. Take the advice of a good slater. So what we're looking for is worn and failing nails. Let's say people will talk about nail sickness, and it's a handy term. There's not really such a thing. What normally happens is that either the nail's corroded, which is rare, or it wears a bigger hole in the slate and the slate pops off. That's more common in Ayrshire. Some of the slates get quite porous and brittle with age, and they absorb a lot of water, and eventually you'll start getting a wee bit of dampness. But a bigger concern is that when they get porous, they'll break after heavy frosts. And that's what you're watching. If you start to get a sudden lot of slates breaking in bad weather, it'll be a combination of wind and frost. And occasionally, particularly some of the later Ballachulish slates, they split down the edge, and you'll recognise that when you see it. So my advice to everyone is get an annual inspection by a good traditional roofer. And there are still a good number of traditional roofers throughout Ayrshire. Certainly not the names that there were 30 years ago in here, where you were spoilt for choice. Likewise, as we moved down to Maybole and Girvan, but they're still out there, trust me. Plus, most roofers still have to deal with slate to pass their apprenticeship. So if we can skill them up as part of our training scheme in Maybole, we should be able to enhance the numbers still further. My issue with Chinese and Spanish slates is primarily around their appearance. They're a different colour, they're thinner, they just look a bit funny. I'll show you another issue with them in a minute. Be cautious. I mean, you will save 20% if you're using Spanish and Chinese slate, but be cautious. They're not necessarily doing what they say in the label. Some people will tell you that second-hand Scottish slates aren't available anymore. That wouldn't be an accurate telling of the facts. They are still available. They're becoming harder. They're always second-hand. They're usually off of demolished schools or big council schemes from the 50s, but we can get them. Wee bit of a cost premium. And then sitting in the middle, you can still get new, or for that matter, second-hand Welsh and Northumbrian slates. Welsh slate particularly is quite common at the moment. Very good slates. but they're out there. They are out there, and don't let other people tell you otherwise. Now, this is imported slate. This is a European slate, mainland European slate, and you see what looks like rust on it. And the problem with these slates is it's got crystalline pyrites in it, fool's gold that hasn't set, and it comes out a roof like rust. So there's another reason. Now, not all of them do this. I would say a minority, but just be aware that you can get these problems, and that's one of the reasons quality control when you're speaking to your slater is so important. Pay a wee bit more, get a better slate if you can. And it's a crying shame in this roof because the lead work and the woodwork's really quite tidy. The slater's just been let down, and you can see where they've failed as a result. This is an example, unfortunately, of some not very good slater work. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking it's great, so let me explain. You can actually see they've not gauged the thickness of the slates. They've thrown them on the roof on the order they've come out. This is Welsh slate, by the way. Very nice slate, but you have to check them for thickness. You start with the heavy slates, then you go into the medium slates, then you go into the thin slates. But unfortunately, what this roofer in, I think Kirkliston, if I remember correctly, has done is throw them on the roof in any old order. It's not just a visual problem. One of the issues with this is that wind and rain will get under the gaps, and you need to be on top of that. Again, worth exploring and discussing with your roofer, making sure he's priced for it. Sometimes, for the best of reasons though, we get a situation where someone just re-roofs half a roof, and we end up with a zebra crossing, unfortunately. And this could have been avoided just with a bit more careful colour matching and things like that. The roof, it's actually not a bad bit of slating on the bottom half. The top half's a bit tired, obviously. I suspect the whole roof needed done in budget, unfortunately, caught someone out here. Could have got away with a lot more if they'd covered it in a bit of yogurt or something to allow the algae and the dirt to set on it. So watch for that. This is the kind of thing that you will notice if you do it in your house. Every day you turn into your road until it weathers in 20 years' time. Because what we're looking for, this is a church in Edinburgh, not one of mine, I hasten to add. But you can see where on the left we had a very tired roof, the lead was weathering off it. We've got this staining off the lead, we've got water coming in at the eaves. And what we're looking for is a nice, tight, well-finished roof. And you should be able to get that in your buildings in Maybole. Or if you're maintaining your roof rather than re-roofing it, getting close to it. Hopefully without an Edinburgh dial-a-bus at the bottom. So ranging on to lead work, all your buildings will have lead flashings in them. They still build buildings with lead flashings. Barratt houses, no offence to Barratt houses, have lead flashings in them. They are one of the most common materials we still use today. And there is usually not a problem getting people that know how to use lead work on a roof. We see a lot of it in flat roofing, as we'll see in a minute. Parapet gutters, weathering, so drips, flashings. Remember the valley gutter we saw in that picture of the roof with the rust type staining on it. And believe it or not, sometimes for downpipes and roans, although that's very unusual in Ayrshire, few examples up Troon direction, sometimes on churches, big country houses. Now, the problem with lead is that it oxidizes and it weathers, especially in these days where rain's a bit more acid because of sort of 20th century pollution. And that means we get fatigue cracks, we get problems at junctions, fine cracks open up. Good lead work will last 70 to 80 years. Sometimes you'll get 100 years out of it. But when it goes, perhaps the drips and the laps just aren't working anymore. We'll quickly get water ingress. So on a day like today, where the sky's open every 2 or 3 hours and we get a downpour, if you've got an intermittent drip in your attic or your top floor bedrooms, it might not be a slate. It might be a dodgy junction in the lead work. Also sometimes, and again, this is an example in my own office, you can get ponding because the original lead work had a backfall in it. And the final thing you get, well, 2 things: foot traffic, people going up to maintain it, putting their foot through it, but poor quality repairs. People put flash band or a bit of tape or denso tape or something on it. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. This is Rothsey, again, not local. A rare sunny day. This is a flat roof. This roof's actually only about 115 years old. You can see yourself, it's very heavily oxidized, not helped by bird droppings and so on. The water's getting in at all the junctions. Somebody's already had a pop at repairing the end bay and felt. That felt, when I surveyed this roof, was less than 5 years old, but had already failed. Yeah, you can see there's ponding on it. The Slater work, funnily enough, looks bad, but it was savable. I think the building's since been saved. I was assessing it for a grant with the original slating, but they've renewed the lead. And when it gets to this stage, unfortunately, you've probably got to bite the bullet, and the question becomes, what materials will I use to replace it? Chimneys. Duncan might correct me, but that might be storing away. This is a chimney's big problem for all of us, right? I've had to rebuild the chimneys in my own house. Where to start? The chimney pots are tired. The copes up and down like a yo-yo. There'll be water getting in at the junctions. What in South Ayrshire you would call flaunching, and in North Ayrshire we would call haunching. Up here the cement work is away. But the biggest problem for me is this lead work. You can see they've tried to patch it where it's failed. There's quite a lot of water getting into this building. So chimneys are one of the hardest bits to reach, but they're worth the investment. They're a barometer for the rest of your building. When you start getting water in your chimney, time to start worrying about the rest of the fabric as well. And like the other building we saw, this one had not a true flat roof in lead. You can see yourself, it's got shallow pitch on it. But again, the water's sitting at the laps and it's driving in. Now, this is the parapet gutter immediately below that, and it's had a lead gutter all the way along the wall head, and someone's put their foot on it here and here. That's not a problem, that's still watertight. But here's one of those tape repairs we were talking about. And in addition, the birds have blocked the gutter supply. We've got big backfalls, which means the water's just wicking up the back of this. And when you get to this stage, you've really got no choice but to replace that lead work in lead or a similar material. The problem is, though, it's expensive. So modern replacements exist, and people will talk to you about these when you're maintaining your building. So for flat roofs, most people will talk about felt. And we all know the problems about felt. Seems to be on Watchdog or that morning show with Gloria Hunniford all the time. Actually, it's possible to do a felt flat roof really well. It's not cheap, but it's possible to do it. You'll save a fortune. But even a good felt flat roof's really got a lifespan of about 15 years. There are other materials such as GRP. I'm not personally a fan of it, or some of the really high quality rubber membranes, some of which I have to say are very good and come with 25-year guarantees, but they're almost as expensive as lead. When it comes to ridging and hats, so your South Ayrshire, so it'll be peens and ridges for you, you get zinc and alloy. And I'm not a big fan of the appearance, but it is literally a tenth the cost. And I have to tell you, it's zinc ridging I've got in my own house. So it would all behoove me to suggest you shouldn't do the same. Easily put on, easily maintained. A lot of contractors used to try and talk people into putting felt gutters, felt valleys, felt parapets. That really is a false economy. You'll not even get 5 years out of that most of the time. For them, you're really having to look at lead or something similar. And it's not hard to do. We'll ignore the fact this gentleman, who I know, very good lead worker, thinks that hard hats and gloves are optional. But this is him preparing a gutter before he slates into it. It's a wee bit time consuming. You can see he's actually welding the joints so that there's no risk of water getting. You can do that under certain circumstances. And I think this photograph's a better part of 20 years old. And that lead is as good now as the day it went on. So as I say, we shout out for doing things in proper lead. Let's jump on to joinery work. Windows, mainly windows. I'll touch on doors. Now this is a wee bit dull, I'm afraid, so I'll apologise now, and I'll get myself a mouthful of tea too. Now, if we go through Maybole, and we're only talking about traditional windows, the main traditional windows used in Ayrshire, indeed most of central Scotland, were timber sash and case. Sometimes in Ayrshire called sliding sash, traditionally. Some of the old joiners still call it that. But for my family, it was always sash and case, so I'm sticking with that. And if you go down Castles or Cassillis, depending on how correct we are, road, you'll still see a lot of these windows, and some of them are very attractive windows. As we move into the interwar period, we get timber casement windows. So anyone like me that grew up in a sort of 1950s, 60s warehouse will have a timber turn windows done in a casement. Believe it or not, there's a limited number of steel and bronze casement. In fact, Turnberry, I'll tell you right now, when we did it, was nearly all steel casement windows. You'll remember them from council houses of our youth, where there was more condensation inside than there was rain outside. And believe it or not, you've got 1 or 2 cast iron window frames in Maybole, but you'll be hard pushed to spot them, and hopefully none of you own them because they're quite a big maintenance burden. If you do, I'm happy to keep you right on them. Now, sash and case windows, there's really important variations in type and style. How we designed them in Scotland and Northern Ireland is very different from the south of England. They have to be designed to suit the weather conditions. But the basic way they work, and you'll all know them from either your own houses or the houses of your forebears, is straightforward. One pane slides down, one pane slides up, and there's various draft proofing strips to stop it. Now, the important thing about sash and case windows is they are easily repaired by a proper, well-trained bench joiner. And again, there are a good number of firms in Ayrshire can do it. But also, and this isn't advertised, particularly by those that sell modern alternatives, they can be upgraded to deal with thermal performance issues. And I'll show you a shot of that in a minute. And that means that we've actually got good examples of windows 100 to 200 years old, still in meaningful use today. Now, the window on the left here is in the West End. It's never been overhauled. It's a late 19th, early 20th century window, still got original stained glass in situ on the inside. It's actually the former regional archaeologist's window, and that works a treat. The other two, though, they're both in John Finney Street in Kilmarnock, and they were overhauled and double glazed as part of the Kilmarnock grant scheme. The grant scheme paid for everything except the double glazed units. More of that another time. But they've been fully draft proofed, they're double glazed, and to look at them, the only giveaway is that the glass is perfectly smooth, unlike traditional glass, which tends to have variations in it. And I wasn't architect in either of these. These were done by other local firms who did a lovely job. So on a sash and case window or a casement window, we'll get wet rot in the windowsills. Windowsills can be cut out and replaced. All of you that have had sash and case windows will know that the cords break and the window doesn't open. It takes about an hour and a half to fix that. I can do that myself. I was taught it by, as it happens, a now retired joiner from Girvan, who said all architects should know how to do it. We can get a bit of wet rot and sliding sash, but again, the sliding sash can be put into a workshop and just a nice wee joint made in it. Nearly all windows are painted open, but at the same time as we fix the sash cords, we can fix that. We just run a Stanley knife. And then finally, the sand mastic round outside cracks and fails. But sand mastic is cheap as buttons. It's far cheaper and far more reliable than modern polysulfide mastics. In those circumstances, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you're in a modern house, use a polysulfide mastic. But if you've got traditional timber windows, you want to be thinking in terms of old-fashioned sand mastic. Most of the Ayrshire contractors still call that a troweling mastic, but for those of a certain age. But when it gets to that stage, most people start thinking about replacement, or their suppliers talk them into it. And the trouble is that that's usually more expensive than actually just overhauling the windows you've got. They can be repaired. You can very often repair your sash and case more cheaply. As I've mentioned, we can draft proof it using off-the-shelf components available from manufacturers both in Scotland and in England. Ironmongery, that brass ironmongery you remember from your granny's house is all still available to buy quite cheaply from Carlisle Brass normally, but there's a good number of suppliers. But the key thing is you need a proper bench joiner. So not a put in your kitchen joiner, with due respect to put in kitchen joiners, but we need a bench joiner of the kind that there are still at least half a dozen firms in Ayrshire and a lot more people working in small workshops. The other problem if we go modern, and why historic environment Scotland and others don't like it, is that the windows and the style are usually a key part of the design, whereas modern replacement units tend to use standard timber sizes, standard astragals, quite often based on English sizes or Welsh sizes rather than Scottish and Irish sizes, and you can get a window that on paper should be the same but actually looks quite different. Also, the timber can be quite variable quality. Now, I know 3 or 4 firms that are making really good modern timber windows using quite expensive wood. So I don't want you to think that all new windows use bad timber. Quite the opposite. There are good people out there. But quite often, especially in imported timber, you'll get quite soft wood, which won't last. And that means that you've got a limited lifespan. And you know, some plastic windows have to be replaced after 15 years. Generally speaking, you'd hope to get about 20 years out of a plastic window. And after 20, they're clinging on by their fingertips. So, whereas Timber well maintained will do you a lifetime, well, more than one lifetime. And we have the same issue of doors, and I'm not going to do doors to death. Again, they'll tend to be non-standard sizes, they'll tend to be bespoke design. You can take them off, you can take them to a workshop, and you can replace it. And I always like showing Jeff Halliday's old office door in Kilmarnock, for those that knew Jeff when he was still with us. And you know, it's actually quite a simple door. This is an oak door for what it's worth. It's original. It's 1930, if I remember correctly. It's still got the original brass on it. And the most Jeff ever had to do when he was still with us was take that off, get some odd spots of damage at the bottom fixed, and pop it back on, and it just sets off the building nicely. But this door is fully 12 inches higher and 6 inches wider than the biggest off-the-shelf door you could buy anyway. So what would we replace it with? If you were to replace this with anything attractive, you're still in a custom-made door. And a custom-made door could easily cost you £1,500 to £2,500. So repair what you've got and work with it. I also like Jeff's had a nice stained glass light in the back there, and at night that looks stunning. So if anyone's got stained glass and wants to know about it, I'm happy to talk you through how you repair that. And you know, this is a modern book for joiners, trainee joiners, but it's still published, that tells them how to make those doors, what sizes to use, what to match. This isn't a dark art where you should be paying through the nose for repairs. Now, I'm going to go a wee bit off piece, away from maintenance onto energy efficiency, because those of you like me that live in old houses will be used to paying Scottish Power and Scottish Gas a small fortune every year. And there is, of course, no way that a traditional solid walled or even a pre-war cavity walled house will be able to perform as efficiently as one of these super duper insulated timber kit houses that are all the rage. But that's not to say we can't do a lot to improve things. And Historic Scotland have produced a wheen of guidance on it. And what they actually did was they bought a house up north and decided to experiment in it. Now, the windows were in when they bought it. So I'm not going to say anything about their look-alike plastic windows. But they bought a fairly standard cottage, and it's a wee bit different from what we would have in Ayrshire and Carrick in particular, but it's about there. Incidentally, it does have one of these front doors that didn't quite fit, so they had to put a wee light in on top of it. I actually quite like the steel shed out the back. That's just me as an architect. So the first thing Historic Scotland did was they put an insulation in the loft, and most of us have that. And Historic Scotland have been experimenting with natural wool insulation, and it doesn't seem to give any problems with vermin or anything like that. It's a wee bit more expensive, but it performs well. If you have a sort of sustainability green agenda, it might be something for you to think about rather than mineral. Certainly it doesn't scratch you the same way. Performs well, lets the building breathe. On the panel doors, obviously the panels in traditional doors can be quite cold. So rather than do what our grannies did and just put a layer of hardboard over the inside of it, they actually, on the inside only, put a wee bit of polystyrene insulation where the panels were, and then covered them in plywood ready for a decorative timber moulding to go on them. Now, I'm told it works a treat. Personally, I think they might have been better putting a draft exclusion strip up this gap in the middle. But that's how simple a lot of these things are to make it work. And this is the replacement window that they started putting in it. Now, you're looking at this and saying, that's just a sash and case window. What's interesting in this is that's actually double glazed with a slimline unit rather than a standard unit. And you would not know from the outside that was double glazed. They've also got quite a nice bit of slater work in there, but no, never mind that. The other thing that you should do, and obviously this isn't a wee cottage, that's a thermal blind. Now again, I remember my granny, in fact my mother still has thermal blinds for her sash and case windows. You would not believe the difference they make. Historic Scotland tested it, and a thermal blind inside a single glazed sash and case window gives you exactly the same performance as a double glazed window would, a normal double glazed window would. So yeah, if you're thinking of spending £2,000 on a new, because to replace those 4 windows would be about £600 each in PVC, maybe a wee bit more. If you're thinking of doing that, then perhaps investing in a set of thermal blinds at 50 quid a pop might be worth a try first, along with overhauling the windows. Obviously, insulate your floors. Everybody forgets to insulate ground floors. Insulate your floors. Personally, I would use mineral wool for that one because you get a wee bit of dampness sometimes on ground floors, but get them insulated and then get the floorboards back down. And preferably do your wiring a wee bit better than this off to the side, but it's Historic Scotland's job, not mine. Historic Scotland are also sort of experimenting with blowing insulation behind lath and plaster. I'm more cautious about that. I'd be worried if damp got in. But you might see them publishing research and support on that. It's certainly something that makes a huge difference to our houses if it works. And in fact, there's the overhauled sash and case window. But the main thing you'll need to do if you haven't done already, while we can still get them, is get a high efficiency modern gas condensing boiler, because the thing that will make the biggest difference to your house and to your bills is actually a really efficient heating system. We can talk about ground source heat pumps and things like that, but for those of us in old traditional buildings, that's unlikely to pay. But a good quality gas boiler, or whatever we might replace them with in 10 years' time, made a huge difference. It knocked nearly a third off the bills in my house when I did it. So only 2 sections left to go, and then I'll hand over to you all for questions. First of all, contractors. Question I always get a lot: how do you find contractors? Quite often I get asked if I can suggest contractors, but grant schemes aren't really allowed to do that. What I would say is, in my experience, there are good traditional masons, both bricky masons and stone masons, slaters come tilers and joiners in Ayrshire, and there's a good number of them, but they tend to be booked up 6 months in advance. You need to do your homework, you need to ask them what they've done, potentially have a look at it and speak to the owners and make sure they're really doing a good job. I would always, for anything but the most minor work, get 3 quotations. You'll all know that. I mean, this really is homes under the hammer type stuff. But the key thing is to make sure everyone spells out in their quotation what they actually do. Handing out grant money, I see a lot of cases where you get a vague quote and then extras come through. Better to have a difficult discussion with the contractor at the outset and figuratively nail them to the mast to find out what he or she thinks they're doing for that, than to deal with it in sight and find you've got a problem. Under no circumstances pay money in advance for materials. I dare say all of you saying who would do that. As an expert witness, it's a problem I see all the time. Reputable firm will generally not have to do that. Start sounding alarm bells. I mean, a cube of stone for a mason to buy is £2,300, but you have no idea how much a cube is. A cube is loads. You will never use a cube on a job. I mean, they're paying hundreds for stone, and if they can't afford hundreds for the stone, do you want to deal with it? But also, if it's complex, if it's really difficult issues around eroding stonework or the kind of defects I've shown you where the iron's coming through, ask a building surveyor, not a general surveyor, a building surveyor, again, good number in Ayrshire, or an architect used to traditional buildings for a bit of advice, even if it's ad hoc advice rather than a full scheme. Final bit, you'll be pleased to hear, statutory consents, which is just a slightly pretentious way of saying planning listed building consents. On a listed building, right, first things first, a building is listed or it is not listed. There is no such thing as the inside is unlisted and the outside's listed, or vice versa. Either a building is listed or it is not. You can't get a wee bitty pregnant, if you'll excuse the phrase. And if you do any work whatsoever that affects the special character, and I don't mean adversely affects it, what the law actually says is affects it, you must seek permission from the council before you start. If you don't get that, it's potentially a criminal offence. In reality, they'll probably just make you redo the work, and you don't want to be paying to do it twice. In unlisted buildings, particularly in conservation areas, you will require permission for most things that would change the appearance of the building. So changing the roof material, in theory, even from Scottish to Spanish or Welsh slate. But perhaps going from slate to concrete or clay tiles would require it. Rendering stone and brickwork. Sometimes in conservation areas, even painting it a different colour. So if in doubt, ask the planning department, or in somewhere like Maybole, by all means, I think Duncan will confirm, ask the grant scheme, they'll keep you right on it. Where Historic Scotland and others giving money, there tends to be more enforcement action as a result of that. Historic Scotland and others put pressure on local authorities. I find in my experience sitting down, so at South Ayrshire Council, the conservation officer is David Harton, absolutely fantastic bloke, very sympathetic, understands the issues we're talking about. Half an hour or a 10-minute chat with David will hopefully set you in a path that will avoid any of these problems. And if any you've dialed in from North or East Ayrshire, I can tell you who David's equivalents are. So I think I'm about to switch it off the screen share, and we'll all be back in the screen again. And over to all of you. I think Harriet's going to lead the way on any questions. You know, as long as it's not making jokes about the fact I have the misfortune to come from Kilmarnock. Over to you all.